I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with all of you today. I'm sharing some work that we did at the Ecological Restoration Institute looking into community wildfire protection plans. And I'll provide a little more context, but we did a deep dive on plans in Arizona, where we're located, and then a broader overview of plans across the Western United States. But I did want to emphasize, because I recognize that the audience here today is really broad geographically, that the nature of the way we sort of looked at CWPPs, I think, is broad in terms of geographical scope. So I hope that the focus we did on plan development and contents will hopefully be broadly relevant to all of you. All right, so with that, let me see if my screen had, let's see if this works. All right, so just wanted to highlight what I'll be speaking about today. So I'll give you just a really quick overview of context and approach for this project. And then I'm just going to touch very briefly on all of our results. As Annie mentioned, there's a report, and I have a link to that at the end of the presentation. There's also a white paper that's a more succinct version of the report, and there's a lot of detail. And so because of time constraints, I'm just going to touch on some stuff in terms of results with respect to scale, because Annie mentioned that was something that folks were interested in. Some highlights regarding what were the perceived most effective elements of plans in Arizona, effectiveness of plans in other Western states, and then some proposed plan elements from some focus groups in Arizona. And then I'll spend a little more time on the lessons learned and recommendations that we developed out of this project. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. So as I mentioned, this project focused specifically, we did a deep dive in Arizona and then a broader look across the West. We were working with the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. And so this was a co-developed project. They were really interested in seeing, what is the state of CWPPs in Arizona, and then trying to understand how other Western states are managing their CWPPs, looking for creative ideas so that we can improve the management of CWPPs in Arizona, and then also throughout the West. And so that was just the general scope of this. We were working closely with DFFM, that's the acronym for Department of Forestry and Fire Management in Arizona. So I'm just gonna give a really quick just overview of what is a CWPP. I think it sounds like everybody here already knows, but just so we're all on the same page, they are documents that facilitate communities in planning for, responding to, and recovering from wildfire events. They were created as part of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003. They are identified in Title I of that act. And what's really interesting about CWPPs is we've had about 20 years now since HFRA was passed. And the three elements that are identified in the act are that the plans need to be developed collaboratively. They need to include some description of how to prioritize or how to assess wildfire risk and use that to prioritize fuel reduction, and then address structural ignitability and how to treat that. But other than that, the act is relatively vague in terms of specifics. And there have been a lot of different documents developed over the years to inform practitioners in terms of how to develop plans. And previous research on CWPPs has sort of said, okay, so maybe that vagueness is part of the genius, because we know that for effective community wildfire planning, it needs to be adapted to the local context. And so some of what we found out with this project is that, yes, absolutely, that is true. We need to use local context. But to some extent, in the context of the plans that we really looked at, some of that vagueness can be hard too, because communities don't know how exactly to structure plans to be actionable. So I'll get into that a little bit more. And then just to contextualize CWPPs within the framework of some of these other ideas, we've got this idea of all lands, all hands, management across landscapes with common goals, not thinking jurisdictionally, but thinking about landscapes. We've got the national cohesive strategy with its three elements about restoring and maintaining landscapes, fire adapted communities, response to fire that's safe and effective. And more recently, we've got shared stewardship, which again is kind of this all lands concept, right? And I would argue actually CWPPs are kind of a building block of a lot of these things because they came early on in this discussion about all lands management. And so I think that the work done around CWPPs has really informed some of these concepts we're working on today, and vice versa. And then I put this in here because I really love this graphic. This is from Fire Adapted Communities, but I just wanted to highlight, where do CWPPs fall within this framework? I thought this was great. I found this when I was doing this research and used this graphic because I just thought it was a good way to kind of think about where do these plans fit in that broader context. And so I've just highlighted there with that red arrow where a CWPP fits in terms of this larger concept of a fire adapted community. So that's a really quick history just to get us all on the same page in terms of language and ideas and concepts around CWPPs. And now I'm just going to give you a brief highlight of how we structured this project. As I mentioned earlier, we worked closely with Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management, and the overall need that was determined was that we wanted to understand what are some best practices and recommendations for effective preparation, revision, and implementation of CWPPs, again, specifically in Arizona, but with learning from across the West. So the way that this project was approached, and it was led by us at the Ecological Restoration Institute, and I don't believe I said this earlier, but if you're not familiar with us, we are one of 3 Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes authorized through Congress, and we work, our money passes through the Forest Service, and so we work carefully with our regional offices to craft plan of work. But our mission is to develop research related to ecological restoration that's relevant to practitioners. And so our audience are really land managers and at that level. And so for some context, that's kind of how we operate. And the methods that we used for this project, so it began with trying to see what is the state of CWPPs in Arizona, given that it's been about 20 years, a little less, since HFRA was passed. There's been a lot of change over the years in terms of where plans are. And so we wanted to kind of gather up all the plans and do a census to understand what's going on in Arizona. The next thing we did was develop a survey that went out to this really broad list of fire departments and districts, state forestry partners, Forest Service, other land management agencies, to understand more details specific to plans. And so we asked respondents to identify the plan with which they were most familiar, and then answer a series of questions about the plan. Next, we did interviews with key partners and DFFM staff to really understand that agency perspective. So the survey was really trying to get more at that fire district and community, fire department level perspective. And then we did the interviews to get more of the agency perspective, but there was a mix of both in there. And then we did another survey that went out to state forestry contacts in other Western states. Some of you may have even responded to that survey. We did try to send it. It was really to try to understand how do other state forestry agencies manage and maintain their CWPPs to inform Arizona's process. Then we did some follow-up interviews. And then the way that this ended was, because we wanted to generate actionable recommendations, we drafted some, based on the preliminary results from those first few phases of the study, we drafted preliminary recommendations, and then I convened 5 focus groups with a couple of select CWPP areas in Arizona, and basically went through those recommendations and vetted them. And that led to this iterative process of improving those recommendations with some on-the-ground knowledge and expertise. And so we'll see some of the results from that process here. All right, as I mentioned, because of time, I'm just going to highlight some stuff quickly. Andy mentioned that scale was a question that folks were interested in. And so one of the things that we did when we were looking at Arizona was to try to understand how have plans evolved since HFRA was passed. And so let me just explain this graphic quickly. But the orange color are new county scale CWPPs. In Arizona, we have only 13 counties, and they're really large geographically. The county where we're located is the same size as Rhode Island. So that's the orange. And then in blue, we have new community scale CWPPs. So that would be something that's sub-county. The purple are updated county scale CWPPs, and then the brown are updated community scale CWPPs. So again, that sub-county scale. So I think just the general trend that you can see, we had no plans in 2003, the year that HFRA was passed. In 2004, there were 7 plans developed in Arizona, 6 of which were that community scale, so not at the county scale. Yavapai County was the only county in Arizona that developed a county-wide plan as their first iteration. But then you can see over the years, we've got, for those first few years, a bunch of new community scale CWPPs. The total number of plans is decreasing over time in terms of new plans being developed. And then we see that we're sort of starting to increase in this county scale. So what we've really seen in Arizona, at least, is a shift from plans at the community scale to plans at the county scale. And so what we have now in Arizona are 9 of our 13 counties are covered by a county-wide CWPP. So scale was one of these questions I asked people about, what do you think? And some general trends, these are general things, this doesn't apply to every case. But what we saw was typically, and this is maybe common knowledge to practitioners like yourselves, but in the county scale CWPPs in Arizona, we often saw that they were being developed by consultants. They were typically a little less specific in recommendations because they were covering large geographic areas. But interestingly, they often used more technical GIS analysis to identify wildfire risk and treatment priorities. So that's just an example of a risk assessment map there below that. And then on the sub-county scale CWPPs, what we found, general trends again, they tended to be developed or led more by local community representatives, like someone from a fire district or department. They often were a little more specific geographically in recommendations, and then often were a little more qualitative in terms of how they described risk. And so this example is just some text pulled from a plan where it's more of a qualitative description of wildfire risk and treatment prioritization. And HFRA doesn't state which it has to be. So it's actually really up to the plan developers. And just a couple illustrative quotes for you to show that there's really a trade-off, and there's this tension between the specificity that you get from a smaller scale plan, so sub-county in Arizona. So this first quote says, I think the smaller scale plans have an opportunity to be more effective in identifying specific treatments. On the flip side, we've got someone arguing that those plans at the county level are good. You don't want communities to be standalone, fend for themselves kind of thing. It takes a lot of time and hours to develop these plans. So just a tension there. Then I'm just going to highlight really quickly some of the other results. There's a lot more detail on this in our report and our white paper, but these are from the surveys of folks in Arizona. And I really wanted to understand, what are the key things that are benefits? What are the things that contribute to success? And what are the things that limit success? And in Arizona, the benefits that were identified were, CWPPs increase community capacity. They help in the identification of new resources. They can expand social networks. They can help folks develop new skills. They can build new social networks and then also expand them. The factors that contributed to CWPP success in Arizona were existing relationships, a shared understanding of wildfire risk reduction measures, understanding of risk itself, sustained communication, and willingness to act to reduce fire risk. And then factors that limited success in Arizona: lack of funding, lack of political support, lack of community involvement, lack of time, both for planning and implementation. And the way the survey was built was we used a lot of the existing research on CWPPs to provide options for people to answer. We did the same thing across the West. So that survey that went out to forestry departments, same thing. The benefits that were identified across the West, we have some similar themes. Fuels reduction is a benefit, identifying risk is a benefit, the collaborative process, new funding streams, and the CWPP as this concept of a foundational document. Limitations, again, we see funding, lack of a clear leader, the plans are outdated, they don't use the best available science, and there's a lack of community interest. And then in terms of what constitutes an effective CWPP, it's collaborative, it's action-oriented, there's community buy-in, and there's funding. So those were some themes from across the West. And I just wanted to hit on one of the things that we did in our focus groups, as I mentioned, that sort of iterative process to get to recommendations, was also talk about, well, what would go into a good plan? Because in Arizona, there was they were looking into developing a template. And so we were trying to figure out, well, if we were to develop a template, what should it include? And so we looked at what other states that have templates, what did they include? And so here are some recommendations based on our focus group respondents of what all plans should include. And those included a statement of why are we doing this CWPP? What are the current conditions of the geographic area that it encompasses? Of course, we need the risk assessment and treatment prioritization, proposed actions and constraints. And there was a big emphasis on including past accomplishments, what has worked well in the past. And then as available benchmarking and monitoring information. And a lot of folks really emphasize that there needs to be an outreach plan. How is this information going to be getting out to the community? Because one of the barriers was really that community engagement, and then key contacts and a glossary. And then there was also this discussion of, you could have minimum required plan elements and then sort of enhanced plan elements. So those might be some optional additional items, that there are different ways you could frame it, but maybe you could have increased funding if you uncovered all these optional additional items, or lots of different ways to think about this. But some of those included summaries of plan sections for a community audience, kind of a roadmap for the community. What does this mean and how do I use it? And then for fire districts and departments, what are training and equipment needs? What's our response capability? Do we have an evacuation plan? Do we have a recovery plan? How are we using social media and getting out that public information, and then resources and funding options? So this was some of the stuff that we generated out of those focus groups. And I realize I'm probably starting to run over on time. Annie, how am I doing?
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. This is great.
Okay, so I'm probably got maybe 7 more minutes tops.
That's just perfect.
Okay.
We are flexible here, and this is what all of these folks have come for. So have at it.
Okay, great. Well, as I mentioned, we really wanted to get to recommendations. And so I developed preliminary recommendations again, as I mentioned, and then had those vetted through this focus group process. And so this is what we came up with. And the recommendations really tended toward how to develop plans and what plans should include. And so that was just the way the conversation evolved in Arizona. But I think that, again, this can be broadly relevant across geographical areas. Excuse me. So the first thing that came across in all of the focus groups was that many plans don't explicitly identify their purpose, how they should be used, and who the audience is. I think generally we see that a lot of CWPPs have potentially multiple audiences, and there's nothing really wrong with that, but it can kind of lead to this idea that they're not actionable for specific audiences. So again, there's a little bit of that tension there between specificity and broadness and what you get from that. But what folks felt would be important, the lesson learned was, again, that CWPPs lack clarity in purpose, use, and audience, and many are trying to accomplish too many things at once. So it may lead to the sense that CWPPs just sit on a shelf, and we don't want that. So the recommendation was that a good plan must be relevant and understandable, and that the partners working on it should reach a common understanding of the CWPP's intended purpose and use. It should also clearly define an audience and even describe how that audience can use the plan. And so if there are multiple audiences, maybe just a tip for how each of those audiences should read the document. And that doesn't need to be lengthy, but some attention to that. The next thing, scale, and we've already talked about this, but as I mentioned, many CWPPs have evolved from a community scale to a county scale. Again, there are trade-offs at these different scales. There's no correct scale. Again, the small scale CWPPs are often more tactical, and the larger scale county plans, especially in Arizona, are often more programmatic. And one of the benefits of the large county scale plan, especially in a place like Arizona, is that it provides cover to all of those communities in the county in terms of funding, right? So if there's a grant that asks whether there's a CWPP, if you got that county scale one and you don't have the capacity at that local level to develop a plan, you're covered. But again, what are the connections there? And so I think the recommendation was that it's important to consider the trade-offs when you're determining the scale of the plan. And those trade-offs should be considered with respect to that intended purpose, use, and audience. And then, of course, the scale should determine the level of detail and the specific content that the plan should include. In terms of guidance and content, and since we were working closely with our state forestry agency here, this is kind of specific to that audience, but the lesson learned was that the expectations of agencies, required plan contents, processes, or steps for creating an official plan are often unclear. So communities don't necessarily know what constitutes an official plan. Does it need to be signed by the state forester? Does anyone have the one that was signed by the state forester? And so the recommendation was that states need to identify, so state forestry agencies or whoever's in charge or responsible for maintaining CWPPs within a state should identify minimum required contents or develop a template, determine whether there are these optional enhanced plan contents, and outline the steps that are required for creating and updating what is considered official for a CWPP. And I think that varies across states. And maybe even within a state across a different state forester if they change. So those requirements just should be really clear for plan developers or communities to develop plans for the local context. This was the big one, and so I'm not going to get into all the details around this, but risk assessment and treatment prioritization. So there are many, many methods for conducting a wildfire risk assessment and determining how to prioritize treatments based on that. But in general, many communities, so at that sub-county scale, lack the capacity to effectively select methods and run these analyses and then interpret the outputs without outside assistance. And again, HIFRA doesn't say how this should be done. So I think it really is maybe something that the states should help direct or provide direction in terms of, you know, here are resources for conducting a risk assessment. Or if the state has a good wildfire risk assessment portal, or there are other analyses that have been done for that geographic area that the communities could tap into. I just think that that can be really confusing, how to do that effectively and use those outputs. And so there should be some attention to how states want that done, because we can also find ourselves in a situation like in Arizona where we've got apples and oranges, where one counties use this and another counties use that, and it becomes difficult to compare. In terms of implementation, leadership, and accountability. A big thing we found in Arizona, and I think this happens in other places as well, that there's a lot of engagement in the plan development, and then the implementation things kind of drop off. And so there maybe is not as much leadership in that implementation phase, which leads to a lack of accountability. So the recommendation there is that the developers, whoever is involved, should really ensure that the steps to implement the CWPP's recommendations are clear and potentially identify accountable owners for those steps. And forming implementation groups can really facilitate this, guide action, maintain momentum, and assist in tracking and updates. Speaking of tracking and accomplishments, in Arizona especially, and across the West too, there's really uneven tracking of CWPP related accomplishments. Some places do really great tracking, some places don't do any. But it makes it difficult to determine whether a given CWPP's recommendations were achieved and whether those, when they were implemented, whether they led to a reduction in wildfire risk. And so really the recommendation from there is pretty straightforward. There should be some accomplishment tracking to facilitate that coordination communication, but it can also help with CWPP updates. And I think another sort of benefit to that is just kind of helping partners sustain their momentum and celebrate their successes. This was a big thing in Arizona. I mentioned it before, it's often difficult to find the official version of a CWPP with the necessary signatures. And so the recommendation there is that there should be some repository to store these final signed plans in a public location. With respect to CWPP updates, so folks really varied in Arizona as to how often they thought CWPPs should be updated. The majority of respondents across surveys and interviews felt that a 5-year update was reasonable, although some places really were arguing that 6 to 8 years was more appropriate for them because it takes so many years to develop the plan, and then you've only got a few to implement it before you need to update it again. But 5 seemed to be the sweet spot. Nonetheless, states should clearly state what that update period should be or what their expectations are. And again, if accomplishment tracking is required, which I'm arguing it should be, that information should be used to update CWPPs when the time comes. Community engagement. This was something we talked about a lot as well with folks, but it varies widely. In Arizona, we have some communities, or Yavapai County was a great example. There's a very involved community group there called the Prescott Area Wildland Urban Interface Coalition. They do a great job of coordinating with agencies, community members, and working on the CWPP and other relevant things. So that's an example of a place where the community engagement is high. But that across Arizona, the engagement varies widely. Many plans lack a clear way to do community outreach and engagement. And so the recommendation from that is that it would be great to the extent possible. This is somewhat of a capacity issue, I think, but if plans can include some public facing materials like a story map or some way to translate the more technical information for a community audience, that can really just help engage the local public. And we're almost done. In Arizona, we've seen a tendency for many of those county scale plans to be developed by contractors, and contractors can provide a lot of needed capacity and experience, especially with that risk assessment process. But they tend to drop off, the community participation tends to drop off according to the contractors too. This was something we interviewed some folks that have done development of CWPPs, and they said they struggle with community engagement. And so the recommendation that we generated from that was that when using contractors, just maybe considering ways to assist them in the community engagement. If there's a local champion that can really be that bridge between the contractor doing the more technical analyses and the community to help translate and facilitate communication. And then just a couple other general recommendations. One idea was that CWPP funding mechanisms. So you know, if there's a hazardous fuels reduction grant that requires a CWPP, maybe it should also build in some accountability for tracking of CWPP accomplishments just to facilitate that process and then help with updates. And then of course, I didn't really we had a lot of conversation in Arizona about tiering plans and whether, you know, counties should have one version of a CWPP and then there should be tiers at smaller geographic scales, and lots of different ideas around that. And I think that the overall recommendation, there was no clear consensus on what that should look like in the Arizona context anyways. But that because there are often many different types of plans floating around, we have county hazard mitigation plans, we have shared stewardship agreements, we have forest plans, that to the extent that there are clear connections between plans, they should be identified so that we don't have these parallel processes. This is a lot of text. I'm not going to read all of this. These are a bunch of rhetorical questions really for, and the way that this was framed was for state forestry agencies, but really it's for anyone that's working on developing a CWPP. But it's just a series of sort of questions to consider as you go through this process. You know, what expectations do you have? What's your audience? What do you want to see in these documents? What would a multi-scaled process look like? This was a big thing in Arizona. What constitutes ownership of a CWPP? What constitutes an official CWPP? So these are just, again, rhetorical, but just something I think that we also discussed in depth with our state forestry partners, and they kind of like this as a way to bring them into what do we want to think about, what matters when we're talking about CWPPs. So just a couple concluding thoughts. I'm sorry if I talked for too long. It's so hard. There's so much in this, and it was exciting to do this research. But the big thing was that the collaborative process is often cited as one of the biggest benefits. Again, I mentioned that it's really important that this stuff be adaptable to a local context. We know that the local context matters, and it needs to, you know, involve the local community to be successful for fire adapted communities. At the same time, communities have a range of capacities. And so I think that our idea with these recommendations was that some clear expectations, steps, and guidance can facilitate things, but not be too prescriptive so that communities can't develop a plan that fits their local needs. So that's really what our intent was. And then I believe Annie provided the link to the report. We also have a white paper, that's the second link, which just really is largely focused on the recommendations. And then I also gave a webinar back in November of last year before some of this was all finalized that you could go and see as well if you wanted more information. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I'm happy to take any questions.